This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Welcome back everyone to the Xcast. The truth is in here. I'm your host today, Carl Sweeney, and thank you for joining me for this, which is an episode all about the brilliant instalment of the X-Files, Oubliette, which I know you'll have recently heard me talking about with Brandon Shea Mutala, but there's more to be said about Oubliette, I think, so we wanted to delve even deeper into the episode. And what I thought was, I'd spoken to Chris Knowles a while ago. I think it was during our Podwatch series when we talked about Conduit. And he started to talk a bit about the symbology at play in Oubliette. And I had to sort of bring the conversation back round to Conduit at the time. But I sort of made a mental note to try and return to it if at all possible. So what I did was I invited Chris on. And I just really gave him the chance to outline what his thoughts were, really. So he goes into a bit of detail here, and it's really fascinating stuff. And we sort of get onto a few other X-Files related topics as we go along, but we always kind of circle back to Oubliette as we do so. So that's what we're here for today. I think the best thing is, after this next jingle, and without any further ado, we get on with the show. Yeah, so we're going to discuss, I'm going to let you talk about like the symbolism in this episode. But I mean, before we come on to it, I mean, this is one of my favourite episodes, really, Oubliette. I mean, do you feel the same way?
Oh, absolutely. For a long time, it actually was my favourite episode. For a long time, it was. I really focused on this episode. I really thought it was like just so central to the X-Files and to the overall, thrust of the series and the overall, the theme of the series that I think is baked right into the mix from the pilot on. This situation with Mulder and his sister and how that drove his obsession, and later on how they developed that storyline and how it plays into the mythology. I just thought that it was an incredibly powerful episode, and incredible performance by David Duchovny, and Gillian Anderson as well. But I think that it's undervalued in a lot of ways, and I also think it sort of set the stage for a lot of episodes to follow, particularly Paper Hearts. I think that Vince Gilligan was very affected by this episode and wanted to follow on. I think you can really trace sort of a through line from this to Paper Hearts and up to Sign and Sight and Closure. And there are probably a lot of stops in between, but I think that those three sort of form their own trilogy within the arc of the series. And in that regard, I mean, I really see this episode as a mythology episode. And not only because of the subtext of Mulder's sister and the abduction, but also how it ties into the the greater mythological narrative, and that is the myth of Demeter and Persephone, or Demeter. I mean, you can pronounce it either way, but I think that there is a very strong and I think a very deliberate injection on the part of Chris Carter of this mythology, classical mythology into, the X-Files mythology. I think that this was deliberately engineered from the start, and that I think that there are all sorts of clues throughout the series that are dropped, indicating this. But I also think this storyline, this mythological arc, from classical mythology, really follows up straight up into the I Want to Believe film. And I think there are even arguments that, a variation on it can be seen through the revival with the William arc, and that the William arc is kind of a variation on it, sort of a gender swapped variation with gods such as Attis and Adonis, and that's it's a very similar storyline where both entail the descent into the underworld. And, we see this in the very last scene of My Struggle 4, where, William emerges from the underworld, from beneath the waves. And we see this in I Want to Believe, which I think is some of the most, at the same time, some of the most explicit use of, let's just call it mystery so we can...
Yeah.
Because it's from the mystery religions, and mystery religions were a group of sort of a phenomenon of religions in the ancient world in antiquity, where people were rejecting sort of the state cults of Greece and Rome and turning to these very personal savior gods. And this is really the first emergence of that mythos that we see, take full flower in Christianity. So Carter, I think, was very well versed in this mythology, and sort of makes allusions to that in Irresistible, when he has Donnie Pfaster sort of sitting in a night class for mythological studies, which seems like a very strange thing to do, for anyone. But I think that there's dialogue in that episode that I think Carter really is sort of pointing to what exactly he's trying to accomplish here, and I think it's interesting because we have this myth of Demeter and Persephone, and let me just sort of delineate this a bit more for people. Mm-hmm. So basically, what it is that there were these cults, these mystery cults in the ancient world, and the most prominent of which was at Eleusis in Greece. And this was sort of a yearly festival. It was sort of like the Lollapalooza or something of the ancient world. Like, seriously, it really was. Yeah. Because, people would come from all around and take drugs and dance and just go crazy and stuff. And it sort of all ended with this performance of the mystery of Demeter and Persephone. And the mystery play here is that Persephone is picking flowers on the slopes of Mount Etna in Sicily. And Hades, the Lord, or Pluto, the Lord of the Underworld, sort of sees her and is entranced by her, and kidnaps her and takes her down to hell. And when Demeter finds out that Persephone has been abducted, she sort of wanders the world looking for her. And as she's doing this, the earth goes barren, and in that very Carter-logific teaser to Emily, we sort of see the most explicit reference to this, where Scully is literally Demeter. I mean, she's literally walking the earth in search of her daughter, and then everything turns to dust. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if you're familiar with the mythology or the mystery arc, it couldn't possibly be more explicit than it is in that teaser. Again, I mean, when we see the in I Want to Believe with the abductions of the FBI agent and the girl at the swimming pool, and you literally see like the Callum Keith Rennie character underwater, so that's indicating that he's in the underworld. And there's all sorts of interesting symbolistic cues in that film that Carter puts in. I mean, quite cannily in that regard, but. So really what the X-Files mythology is, and is as established in the very first episode, in that iconic motel room scene, that in any real, if that was in the real world, I mean, that would have ended, in just like really hot, messy sex. I mean, it's just like, but of course it's a science fiction program, so it didn't. So anyway, so in this mystery cycle, Demeter wanders the earth in search of Persephone, finds out that she has been taken to hell, and with the aid of Hermes, the god of knowledge and writing, who's sort of like in this storyline is represented by Skinner, in my estimation, is taken down to the underworld, and Pluto says to Demeter, "Well, listen, she's my queen now. She's the queen of hell. I mean, she has to stay here." And they sort of bargain, and Demeter bargains for her to come back to the earth, but Pluto tricks Persephone into eating pomegranate seeds, and so she has to stay for the winter in the underworld. And it's all about, really what it boils down to is that it's a myth about the growing seasons, and how the earth dies in the winter and so on and so forth. I mean, there were only 3 seasons in ancient Greece. They didn't. It didn't have the same kind of situation we had because of their climate and whatnot. So anyway, really this mythology and there are all the variations about it. And Carter was like very clever, and whatever writers were sort of taking part in this were very clever about seeding this throughout the myth arc. So this is why I see Oubliette as a mythology episode, because not only does it have the parallels with Mulder's sister, even though he explicitly denies it in the text of this episode, but I mean, where is Amy Jacobs taken? She's taken to the underworld. I mean, that's like the literal reference in the title here. The oubliette is the basement door. So that theme, the abduction theme, that just runs throughout the series, and then there are variations on it, where there are male gods like Osiris and Dionysus and so on and so forth, Adonis and Attis, and those are referenced throughout the and I would argue, quite intentionally and explicitly throughout the series. So it's like, if you really want to understand the mythology and just sort of like this almost like parallel sort of rational, not quite, people sort of see this all as being very haphazard and arbitrary, but in fact it's more often than not following the arcs of these mystery cycles. And it just might sound completely esoteric to a lot of people, but I think that if you study the myths, I mean, even like a cursory glance at this mythology, you're going to see it over and over again, and again, all the variations, because, there's the Mulder abduction. And, of course, I mean, Scully herself becomes Persephone in, when she's abducted. So, and there's a lot of gender swapping as far as the specific roles. But, I mean, here's another example. So, the myth of Persephone is, and I've really detailed this on the blog, is very, maybe not explicitly, but very strongly symbolically referenced in I Want to Believe. But Fight the Future, Fight the Future, again, it's the journey to the underworld, right? Where does he go? He goes to the bottom of the earth, to Antarctica, and this ship buried deep within the earth. So it's the underworld. I mean, it's literally, he's literally going to the underworld in more ways than one to rescue Scully, who is, been in prison. And what this particular myth is that it's referencing Orpheus and Eurydice. And of course, there's been a lot of there's a very well-known Brazilian movie called Black Orpheus, and this whole sort of constellation has been referenced in pretty well-known. Jean Cocteau did a film on Orpheus in the late 50s. So there's been this myth has welled up, and I think that Carter, when he was getting his English degree and so on and so forth, was probably very interested in stuff and studied it in school. And of course, the great example of this is George Lucas, and referencing Joseph Campbell and whatnot. So, I mean, this is mythological allegory is not only as old as time, but it's as new as current Hollywood. I mean, it's just like if you want to really tap into those primal storytelling urges, you go for that. So the reason that I think that Oubliette is so powerful is not only just because of the story itself, but it ends up on the river Styx. It's Hades abducting Persephone. I mean, it almost couldn't be more explicit. It's like Amy Jacobs is abducted, and the whole scene plays out, and she drowns in the river Styx, and then she's revived by Mulder. But there's also this sort of transference transference with Lucy. So this interesting connection between Lucy and Amy. It's like Lucy was once Persephone. She was once the little girl lost, the little girl taken to the underworld. But in her adulthood, she becomes Demeter. She becomes the woman searching, even though she doesn't even realize it. But through this psychic link, she is now Demeter. It's like this. It's almost like this turnover, this generational turnover, where through her ordeal, she is psychically attuned to the sufferings of this other character. So in that regard, if we wanted to draw the sort of mythological parallels here, we have, Amy is Persephone, Lucy is Demeter, and Mulder is Hermes. So it's the same core of this mystery told over and over again. And then when you fast forward this to the 8th season, they draw on the male variants of this with Osiris and Dionysus and these figures. Particularly Osiris. One thing that I had done, several years ago is really detailed the parallels between Mulder's abduction and the death of Osiris. And again, because it couldn't be more explicit because Scully is Isis, she's the magician, and as well as the consort, and Doggett is Anubis. Anubis is he's the dog-headed or jackal-headed god of the dead. Skinner is the scribe, he's the record keeper. It just goes on and on and on. And, these interesting sort of roles that, these characters come in and out of. For instance, in this instance with Mulder's abduction, when I saw that in that first, appearance of Monica when she was like sort of staring at the Morley lights, I was like, well, she is Nephthys, and Nephthys is not only the sister of Isis, but she is the consort of Set, and Set is Satan, Set is the demon. So when Monica ends up with Smoking Man, and everybody's like so outraged about it, and so on and so forth, in that instance, it made sense to me because Monica is set up as Nephthys in the allegory that we see throughout the 8th season. So, why wouldn't she end up, with her mythological husband? And again, this might seem a bit arcane and a bit convoluted to some people, but it's actually very simple. It's like you can just draw out sort of a spreadsheet in Excel and just, write down each character in the cast of the X-Files, and then just, assign them their mythological, counterparts. And it's actually, very simple. There are a lot of people who will argue that these myths that repeat with different variations throughout ancient history are really just all based on one myth. There's a core myth, and it just it's spread to all these different cities and cultures, and they put their own spin on it. But it's really, it's based on a single myth. And some would argue that it's based on the myth of Inanna and Dumuzi. And that goes back to ancient Sumer, so you're talking the first recorded civilization in history, or in our history at least. So, again, this sounds like maybe a bit, maybe sounds to some people like, reading too much into it, but it's actually like incredibly blatant and obvious if you understand the mythology and you see, a lot of the cues, because Carter would put these cues throughout the series, when you have like Zeus genetics and you have Demeter Road, and he's always sort of dropping in these
Pandora Street was one.
Yeah, exactly. So it's all drawing on these these really kind of like foundational myths. We know them from the Greeks, but there's a school of thought, and I think it's a pretty well attested school of thought that these myths all come from ancient Mesopotamia, from Babylon, and that the Greeks basically absconded a lot of them when they really became very intimately involved with Babylon in certainly in the late Neo-Assyrian period, but certainly with the rise of Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes and then later on the Seleucid emperors of Babylon, which were just basically Greek generals who had taken Mesopotamia as spoils of war after Alexander's conquest of the known world. Again, it sounds like overly complicated, maybe a little too overly intellectualized to people, but this, to me, it's like art appreciation. It's like if you understand the mythology and you understand how the mythology acts within the X-Files mythology, it really deepens your appreciation, because you really start to see that the what might seem arbitrary or accidental or just sort of like half-assed and made up as you go along is really sort of following a different cycle. It's following a different narrative, and in that regard, it makes a lot more sense than I think people give it credit for.
No, I think it's fascinating, and it'll be good where we can on the podcast to kind of like call on you from time to time and kind of get you to point us in the right direction, But as you said, you've blogged about it like extensively, haven't you?
Yeah, I have, and particularly in regards to I Want to Believe, because when I saw actually when I first heard about Want to Believe, when I heard what the plot was before I'd even seen it, and it's like Mulder and Scully are wandering around the wilderness, gathering up body parts. I'm like, oh, gee, yeah, that's Osiris. I mean, that's, to me, it was like a clear signal that we were going to be looking at the mysteries. We were going to look, at this ancient narrative again. And if you just, again, a cursory read of the myths, it's going to just open up like a flower. And the interesting thing in this regard is that it ties into another strand that I've documented throughout the series of the X-Files, and that's this fixation on hallucinogenic drugs, on what they call an entheogenic theory, and how that ties into what people call aliens. I mean, it's actually it's really fascinating, because all these things, and never. Because Carter, of course, will never acknowledge anything, ever, the Sphinx. But if you understand, even just like a Wikipedia reading of the mythology, these ancient mythologies, it's just, a light bulb's going to go off in your head, and it's like, oh my God, this is just everywhere in the X-Files.
Yeah, and in terms of what you were saying about it being like, or being perceived as like too arcane, I mean, in the case of Oubliette, though, like you say, it's quite
visceral.
Yeah, and I mean, you've got that, like, really, I find it quite chilling visual emblem of, like, the red light. I mean, do you see that as tying into these things that you're talking about as well?
Yeah, sure, because it symbolizes hell.
Yeah.
It's like the red fire, like red has always been associated, at least, in ancient Greece, it would have been gray. But with the rise of Zoroastrianism, again, in Mesopotamia, and how Zoroastrianism influenced the Greeks, and how this combination of Zoroastrianism and Greek thinking really influenced the Jews in Alexandria and Syria, and how this played into the development of Christianity, particularly with things like the angels. The angels are Zoroastrian. The angels are not really known as a separate phenomenon in classical Judaism, pre-Babylon captivity. So that red, it's a very powerful and very simple. I mean, this is the thing that I think is the genius of Oubliette, is that if you really want to look into all the subtext, you can just get lost forever. But they all boil it down to this incredibly brutal and visceral and primal story. I mean, what could be more horrifying? It's like the abduction of a child. It's just sheer terror, particularly if you're a parent. And this is like, why I think the X-Files is sort of underappreciated today, because I think the reasons why it was so zeitgeist and why it was so powerful is that there are all these strands that people are picking up on subconsciously. They're not necessarily intellectualizing, they're not processing on an unconscious level, but it's all there, and it's all just like pressing all those buttons, and again, I mean, I don't think people consciously acknowledged it, but it affected them on a psychological, if not a psychic level. And this is the genius of Chris Carter. I mean, Chris Carter, genius is an interesting phenomenon, because genius, very often goes off the rails. That's something people tend to acknowledge. I mean, just look at the history of genius. Just look like somebody like a Brian Wilson, or just genius itself is messy and dangerous. So I mean, I think that's just all part of the mix here. But in this regard, I think what gave the X-Files this incredible resonance, and why it just dug its way into people's unconsciousness, is because it's playing on these very old and very powerful and primal, mythologies, and I would argue that Oubliette is one of his best examples of this. And I think, again, I mean, I personally believe, and I didn't ask him or speak to him about this, but I really think that Vince Gilligan was very affected by Oubliette, and I think that Oubliette is really the mother of Paper Hearts. I don't think without Oubliette you would have Paper Hearts, and without Paper Hearts or Oubliette you wouldn't have Silent Night Enclosure. And of course, I know some people have mixed feelings about it. I mean, I just remember watching Closure, and when that. Yeah. The final credit came up, produced by Chris Carter. I was like, that was just the most intense, devastating experience that I've ever had watching television. And and then I went online, and everybody's like, oh, that sucks. And it's just like, oh, I just give up on these people forever. I just don't care what they say about anything for the rest of my life.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of Oubliette being such a powerful episode, I think one of the most wrenching moments is when Mulder comes to Lucy's body at the end. And I know you've got this notion, haven't you, that Samantha was always dead, kind of in the minds of Carter and the other writers all along. And,
yeah.
You sort of see this scene as kind of an analogue for Mulder and his sister's body, do you? Is that right?
Yeah, I do. I think that it's interesting, too, because there's always been a lot of debate and consternation, because I think everybody just wanted the skies to open and the flying saucers to descend and Samantha and Mulder to sort of hug and ride off into the sunset or something. But I really think, I think that if you go back and look at it from the very first episode, from the pilot episode, to me it's with the eyes that I see now, and I go back and look at it, even on its own, even, independent of the episodes that follow, to me, it's very clear that, because it starts off with a dead girl, right? The very first teaser of the series, it's not dealing with a girl who's been abducted and returned. It's a girl who's abducted and is dead. And I think that's your first clue. And again, Carter's get this Sphinx-like attitude, and he's always being extremely coy and cagey about these things, but it's that's what it starts off with. It starts off with a dead girl, and then what's the parallel that's drawn? Is Mulder, saying that his sister was abducted by aliens, and to me, it's just Mulder is unable to deal with the conscious knowledge that his sister is dead, that his sister is lost forever to him, so he has to pursue this. What really starts off as a ridiculous fantasy, of, she was abducted, and, all these different narratives, emerging in the sessions, the hypnosis sessions and stuff. And even how, the first episode of the first season and the first episode of the second season, tell two completely different stories about how Samantha was taken. You see what I'm saying? So it's I think that if you draw that back to that first teaser in the series that is about a girl who's abducted from her bedroom and winds up dead, I think that's your first clue. And it's it couldn't be any. It could only be early if it was I don't know, somehow time warped back, before the series even existed. I mean, it's literally the first thing you see. So to me, that to me is the clue. And again, this is just Carter's thinking, which is very fractal and very sort of fourth dimensional chess. But he sort of, in all fairness, he does outsmart himself quite a bit throughout the series history. But I think Samantha was always dead. I think that the Mulder's quest was really, he wasn't running towards his sister. He was running away from the reality of his sister's death. And I think that if you approach the series with that understanding, Oubliette just becomes just even more cathartic and gripping and painful and just, and even, with Paper Hearts, because Paper Hearts to me is Mulder, it's this dawning realization that, so say she was taken, and was returned, and so on and so forth, as we see in Sign and Sight and Closure. I mean, it doesn't matter what happened in the interim. What the reality that he's facing now is that his sister is dead and gone and will never return.
Yeah, and in Oubliette, I mean, I do like the fact he rejects the comparison that Scully makes, though, because I sort of feel it allows Lucy and Amy to kind of flourish as characters in their own right, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that was a very canny move, but it also, to me, it speaks to denial as well. I mean, one of the problems that people have with the X-Files, and I find it very frustrating, is that everybody takes what everybody says, at face value. And to me, my basic premise in going into the series is that everybody lies. Everybody's constantly lying, and it's like, this is not like me reading something into it. It's like, you can name 100 instances throughout the series where major characters just flat out lie to one another. So
yeah, and like probably 10 instances where the tagline is changed to something about denial or I want to lie, or that kind of deceive, inveigle, and obfuscate, and all sorts. Just finally then on Oubliette, I mean, I find it kind of baffling why this is kind of why the fan reaction isn't more kind of positive towards this one.
Is it not positive, or is it just sort of neutral and
indifferent, I guess? A lot of fans, I don't know, almost treat it as kind of a middle-of-the-road episode or something. And, I mean, what do you put that down to? Because I know you're quite kind of astute on, like, the fandom and stuff. So, I mean, what do you think it is exactly that people maybe don't key into, aside from, like, the symbolism and stuff? Why don't they enjoy it kind of on a surface level?
I think because it's dark and painful,
yeah,
and deals with topics that people don't like to think about. You know what I mean? Particularly since the fandom is so heavily female, I think that a lot of female fans are uncomfortable, with the story arc, because it really plays into their own primal fears, of being the victims of male-directed violence. So, I mean, I can certainly understand that. It's, it's a very difficult and thorny issue to confront, and I don't blame people for that. But what I would argue is that a lot of it also has to do with there were, when a lot of fans were watching this, they were basically Amy Jacobs themselves. I mean, they were teenage girls, and it's like it doesn't necessarily hit you on a conscious level, but it hits you on a primal level. And I think that people who were older and people who had children, I think it probably spoke to them more. Again, I mean, one of the things that I really have to impart, and I don't want anybody to be offended by this, but the fandom as we understand it, insofar as online fandom, was just such a small corner of the viewership.
Yeah.
In the series history. I mean, at best, if we looked at online fandom, we could say actively, maybe a few thousand people, right? Mm-hmm. And the few thousand people who are sort of staying with the franchise, 20 years past its peak.
Yeah. And
fandoms have immense distorting effects. Because I think that the tastes and the opinions of fandom really have no bearing on the tastes and opinions of the 20 million people who are watching the X-Files every week. And I think a lot of those 20 million people were themselves parents, adults, so they responded to these stories differently. And it's always fascinating to me, like, to come from fandom and to be immersed in fandom, and then to step out into the world outside and just see how, like, variously different people who are not fans, who aren't engaged in the culture, aren't engaged in the online fandom, just the way they see the episodes. I mean, one of the examples that I've always given is, like, just how many people just hate the comedy episodes. And I'm always just like, really? It's like, I mean, there are a lot of, granted, there are a lot of comedy episodes that I don't like, but it's just like, that's sort of like, that's the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down. It's like, to me, it's like, that's like such a core of the X-Files identity. But it's like, I can't tell you how many people outside of, when people were discussing the X-Files in different forum on Facebook, not X-Files fandom, and they were talking about, like, why are they doing these stupid comedy episodes? We hate these. It's like, it's just like this weird sort of jarring reality check that the fandom is just such a different phenomenon than the overall viewership, even to this day. Like with the ratings being so diminished in this last season, which I find to be a tragedy. I just watched Familiar.
It's a shame,
yeah, I watched Familiar again last night, and I was just like, this is just like the most incredible thing. And not only is it like season 2, season 3 X-Files distilled, it's like the quintessence of it, but just in its own merits, it's a phenomenal piece of television. And it's interesting too, because if you really wanted to get fancy, I mean, you could argue that Familiar is sort of not only tracing back to this lost child mythology that we see in the teaser of the first episode, but also to Oubliette. I mean, I think there are strands of commonality there, and I think one of the reasons I love that episode so deeply is not only that it's just, I think it's a great piece of writing on its own merits, but it just encapsulates so much of what made the X-Files work in its prime, and I think that just to bring this again back to Oubliette, it's like this primal human drama of like losing a child. There's nothing more devastating, to a human being,
All right, everyone. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. That just about wraps it up for us today. I mean, if you want to check out a bit more of what Chris has to say, of course, as many of you will know, you can go to his blog, The Secret Sun. There's an X-Files tag there you can click on, and he's written loads and loads over the years about the series. So you can do that, or you can check out the complete X-Files book he co-authored as well. As for us on the Xcast, we'll be back very soon, of course, and you can find us online in all the usual places. But until next time, trust no one.
The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and presented by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated group of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find us on Twitter at the Xcast, and on Facebook if you type in the Xcast, or at our group X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, where you can continue the discussion about all things Mulder and Scully. If you want to support the Xcast further, you can now subscribe and become a patron of the show on Patreon. On Google, just type patreon.com/the Xcast. That's Patreon. You'll see all of our tiers, subscription options and perks, which include early access to episodes, bonus content such as commentaries on X-Files episodes, access to a patron chat zone, and even appearing on one of our patron roundtable discussions. We would appreciate any support you can give the show, so just go to patreon.com/the Xcast to find out more. Our title music is provided courtesy of Will A, who you can find on Twitter at IamWillAYE.